Mm. Okay. Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Mr. Carl Nagin, a distinguished writer, educator, and researcher who has a deep passion in modern Chinese art and culture. With a background both in journalism and documentary writing, with works for PBS as well as NPR, he has devoted most his career in researching Chinese artists, and he writes about the most important Chinese art figure, Chang Dai-ch'ien, and he's going to publish a biography of Chang Dai-ch'ien written in English, first time written in English, very soon. We hope hopefully very soon.
I hope.
Yes. So today he will guide us through the wonderful world, a wonderful life of Chang Dai-ch'ien in this lecture. So let's welcome Mr. Carl Nagin.
Thank you, Cecilia.
Please.
Thank you.
Maybe.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's better if I sit just for a little bit. Thank you so much for coming today. I feel so honored to be able to speak with you and share some of my ideas as well as my struggles, some of my misunderstandings about, pardon me?
Yeah.
It's okay. Sorry. About Chang Dai. And I want to do, first of all, I want to thank you, Jianhua, for inviting me to give this talk and share some of my ideas and questions with you, because I'd like to explore some ideas that I have. Wei Min, welcome everybody. Please sit. So nice to see all of you. Diana, I have friends here. This is great. And Xing Lu and Harry, thank you so much for, first of all, inviting me and making me feel so welcome. And this wonderful exhibit and a series of exhibits that Jianhua has put together. Sometimes when I speak to Jianhua, I just feel so humbled because he really should be writing a biography of Chang Dai-ch'ien. He knows more about Chang Dai-ch'ien, I think, than anybody I've ever met. So I'll start talking about something. He said, no, wait. No, that's not when that happened. It's like this. Okay, thank you. Lao Shu.
Yeah.
But maybe I thought I'd begin to talk a little bit about why I decided to write about Chang Dai-ch'ien. And it's been a long journey. I've been working on this really since the 1970s in some ways, first with some magazine articles. I began my work on Chang Dai-ch'ien as a journalist. And my specialty at that time was doing investigative reporting for PBS and as a print journalist for the New Yorker and other magazines about ethical issues in the art world. I was fascinated, particularly initially, with the problem of the looting of archaeological sites around the world and the misbehavior, I would call it sometimes, of museums, collectors, dealers, auction houses in not saying where things came from. They collect all these antiquities from Latin American countries, from Italy, from whether they're Greek and Roman materials or Aztec pre-Columbian materials, sometimes Chinese materials. And the attitude in the art market was you don't say where things come from. So you had a tension, I noticed, between the viewpoints of archaeologists on the one hand and art dealers, museums, auction houses on the other, because sometimes in the art pyramid, antiquities that have been looted or illicitly acquired are breaking national laws, national patrimony laws. As you well know, in China, this has a particularly important role in our understanding of Dunhuang and the Silk Road, because for a long time, the materials in the caves of the Thousand Buddhas, and this is, of course, very relevant to Chang Dai-ch'ien. He spent nearly 3 years there. At the end of the Qing dynasty, the cultural property and cultural heritage of China was not being very well maintained. During the Sino-Japanese War, the Longmen caves with their hundreds of thousands of statues of Buddhist art were plundered, stolen by the Japanese. Chang Dai-ch'ien and his brother Shansi went to Longmen and were appalled by what they saw there. So there was a change during the Republican government. One other very important point here was that Dunhuang had been rediscovered, let us say, by a group of European archaeologists, European and American archaeologists, kind of early day precursors of Indiana Jones, who had gone up to Dunhuang in the early 1900s, knowing that the Taoist priest who was taking care of those caves had discovered a library with tens of thousands of manuscripts, scrolls, Buddhist scrolls, in many, many different languages. And these had been taken along with Buddhist art, statuary, brought back to Europe by particularly Sir Aurel Stein to the British Museum and Paul Pelliot at the Musée Guimet. And so this was at a time, of course, when China was suffering civil war and warlords did not have the material means to maintain these sites. This is often the case, true in Latin America, true even in Europe. You have this kind of looting and plundering that goes on. And the destruction of the in situ knowledge of what did that library look like, actually, that the Taoist priest had discovered. Why were they there in the first place? Why was it hidden away? All of that knowledge, in a sense, is lost when things are taken out of context. So I was very interested in this as a phenomenon. On the one hand, you had museums, collectors, art dealers who want to acquire things, right? And then on the other hand, you have archaeologists, historians who want to preserve things, conserve things. Now, when Chang Dai-ch'ien went to Dunhuang, this was very much on his mind. And this is at a time in Chinese, modern Chinese history, where again, these caves had been neglected. They were kind of that art, as Zhang himself wrote in the introduction to his catalog of the Dunhuang mural copies that he did there. He said that there's no record of this art in the history books, in the art books of China. There's no record of this extraordinary gallery of over 1,000 years of Buddhist art, of Chinese art. There's no record of it. So here he was at a turning point in his career. And I do think that Dunhuang, and I know that Jen was going to have an exhibit of Dunhuang materials, really looking forward to that. Here is Zhang suddenly in this role. First of all, he's rediscovering a lost tradition of figure painting. This is a transformative moment for him. He had been told about the caves, he'd been told about Buddhist art, but he really didn't know that much about it until he saw it. And so he spent the first visit that he made there, he spent a lot of time just cataloging, numbering the caves, what was up there. And he saw that in these extraordinary murals that were on the walls, that there were layers of paint, layers of going back, you'd have a Yuan dynasty painting covering an earlier painting, and he found one wall that was slightly ruined, and he started peeling back the layers to get to the Tang, Sui, early dynasty art that was there, because that's what he thought. He thought, this is the pure Chinese tradition of figure painting. This is what I want to copy. This is what I want to know. He also realized that a lot of those images, those early Tang and earlier dynasty work, that he really didn't know how to get the pigments right, the colors right, and also the colors had changed over time. They'd been there was discoloration, there was material deterioration of the colors. So he wanted to get back to the primitive, get back to the beginning, get back to the pure essence of this tradition. And I tell this story because I think this is something that underlies a lot of Chang Dai-ch'ien's work. He wants to get back to the pure essence, what he sees, what he perceives to be the pure essence of Chinese painting in its most primitive state. And primitive, I'm using that word in the sense of original state. What did this look like? What is the spirit of this kind of painting? So he's also realizing he doesn't have the technical expertise to understand how to make these copies. So what does he do? He sends his son to a small part of in Tibet, where there is a tradition of Tanka painters that he had encountered. He had actually gone there before. And he had to deal with a warlord, a General Ma, to even get access to this place. He sends his son there to hire 4 Tibetan Tanka painters. Now, this particular village, this particular part of Eastern, what is now, I guess, the Eastern Autonomous Region of Tibet, has a tradition going back to the Middle Ages, going back to the Tang Dynasty. Even the dialect they spoke there is a version of Tang Dynasty Chinese. So, or Tibetan, I should say. So he hires these Tanka painters. He had seen their work. And mind you, these Buddhist lamas that came to Dunhuang with him had never been to Dunhuang. So imagine what they felt when they encountered this open gallery of these caves at the end of the Silk Road. Imagine how they felt. These were monks and lamas for whom the making of art, the making of tankas, was itself a spiritual act. It was an offering, right? As it had been in the time of the Silk Road. You had the caravans coming by, right? And they wanted blessings of the monks. And remember, Dunhuang, what does Dunhuang mean in Chinese? Bright beacon. It's the bright opening. It's the bright light. This is the entry point of Buddhism into China. It's the end of the Silk Roads, plural, because there were multiple routes. It's a convergence of those caravan routes. The entry point to Xi'an, Chang'an, right? So this is an important, very cosmopolitan place. Lots of minority cultures, Tibetan, all kinds of this is a place of encounter between the nomadic tribes in these kingdoms, the Western kingdoms, so-called Western kingdoms. Interesting that if you look at references to Dunhuang, the area is called the Western Kingdoms because it was a place that was ruled by very different cultures at different times in history. Sometimes Tibetan, sometimes Sogdian. You can see on the walls and the murals influences from Persia. Remember, this is the connecting road between Central Asia and Rome and Greece. So it's an east-west convergence. And I like the metaphor of that. I like this kind of place encounter point, transmission point of not only of goods in caravans, but of ideas, religious ideas. Such an important place, and yet forgotten about, really, in some sense, in China since the Yuan dynasty. So these caves were abandoned. They were up there. Chang Dai-ch'ien arrives there. He has these lamas working with him, teaching him how to grind lapis lazuli, how to grind the minerals. A couple of weeks ago, wonderful exhibit here, Niangbun, who is actually the disciple of the very lama that Chang Dai-ch'ien brought to Dunhuang, carrying on that tradition. Beautiful exhibit of Tanka paintings, an extraordinary man, extraordinary. Someone who spends more than a year and a half painting Tankas. Wow, one Tanka, extraordinary. And you see in the, I was so struck by the colors, particularly the lapis lazuli, because the some of the mineral content actually sparkles. And John wanted some of those effects. He wanted to learn, how do you do that? He also realized he had to develop a different set of techniques to copy these murals. He also needed very, very large size cloth and silk. So he had to, and he needed the expertise of these lamas to help him solve the problem of how do you sew together two large pieces of silk or cloth so there's no indication of the binding. They knew this. So here he is learning again, going back to the primitive, going back to the original, trying to find what's the essence of this. And of course, if you read Zhang's writing about the Dunhuang caves, he published a very large book numbering the caves. He was really the first person to systematically number these over 500 caves in Dunhuang. And not just in Dunhuang, he also went to Yulin, he went to the Western caves, the Eastern caves, an extraordinary effort at a time when Dunhuang was, you know, there were bandits up there, wolves, there was no electricity. The caves are facing in a way, so there's very little sunlight during the day. So they had to figure out a way to illuminate the caves enough so that they could copy them. And he had to develop, he had to learn a technique of how to do a first draft, right? And the Tibetans knew how to puncture holes in the outline of the figures, the Buddhist figures. And then they would take either a powder or they'd use oil to transfer that onto a second draft. And then a third draft that's made on the cloth. And then once you have the outline of the figures, and you can see this in some of the examples that you have here in the gallery, filling in the color and getting the colors right. This is an extraordinary process, complicated process that Zhang had to use and had to learn with the lamas. Of course, then his son and some of his family, Xie Zhiliu, the famous connoisseur from Shanghai, came to work with him there. But, you know, except for the lamas, none of these people really knew that much about this art. So Zhang is doing a particular kind of copying. And I want to talk today about ideas of copying, because this is one of the first things that I had to learn about Chang Dai-ch'ien and to learn about Chinese painting, is the importance of copying, the role that copying plays in how artists learn how to paint. A much more complex vocabulary even of what we call copies. And of course, Zhang had this other dimension of his life as a forger, what we would call a forger. And so it took me a long time to really, you know, the word forgery has such a nefarious negative connotation in the West. We think of forgers as the Western paradigm of the forger, Hans von Meegeren, a famous forger of Vermeer paintings. There's something slightly criminal, but interesting, because we want to know, how do they do it? How do they get away with this? How do they do it? And usually in the West, we think of the forger as a failed artist, someone who really couldn't make it on his own with his own work. So I'll show the art market. I'm going to do a Vermeer that's so good, right, That'll show them how good a painter I am. It'll fool everybody. That's not the Chinese idea of a forger or a copyist. The vocabulary for copying and forgery in Chinese is vast. I'd say there's probably more than a dozen different words for different types of copying. And now when Chang Dai-ch'ien went to Dunhuang, he wasn't making forgeries. Well, in fact, he did make a few forgeries up there. We'll get to that in a little bit. But the copies that he made of the murals themselves were bona fide copies. That is to say, there was no ill intent to fool anybody. What he was trying to do there was to rediscover and repossess and bring into the modern era a lost tradition of figure painting. And this was an enormous contribution on his part. The time that he spent up there, he produced nearly 300. Numbers for this vary. Sometimes I see 200, 270, 300 separate murals, mural copies that he did, probably. That now, again, context matters. Context matters so much in speaking about paintings. And by context here, I mean, why was it, we would think, okay, here's somebody who's going, let's think of a Western equivalent. Here's somebody who's going to learn how to paint, and he goes to the Sistine Chapel, and he spends 3 years copying the wonderful murals where the Pope was just, our new Pope Leo, the world's new Pope Leo has been chosen, right? And you're not going to get a lot of sales for that. First of all, a lot of people have seen the Sistine Chapel. So it might be a good exercise for an artist to copy parts of these murals. But Chang Dai-ch'ien is doing something very different because the copies that he made at Dunhuang are not exact copies. They're a kind of imagined archaeological copy. He's imagining what these paintings actually looked like back in the Tang Dynasty before discoloration, before time had made these paintings deteriorate. And he's reimagining them for modern eyes because he realizes when he actually exhibits these, as he does in the mid-1940s in Langzhou, exhibits in Chengdu and Chongqing, this was at a moment, remember, this is wartime China, Sino-Japanese War, right? And it's in the context, the larger context of China trying to rediscover its national identity when it's being threatened on the one hand by the Japanese. And it's been, in a very demoralizing way, plundered by Western European foreign devils on the Silk Road, that is Paleo, Orelstein, even Harvard University, was involved, the Russians were involved. A whole group of these adventurer archaeologists had gone to Dunhuang and taken things away. So in a sense, there's a resentment, very understandable resentment on the one hand of the Chinese against this loss of their heritage. And this is all happening in the context of the chaos of the Sino-Japanese War, World War II, very uncertain times. The Republican government and the communists for one moment are joining forces to resist the Japanese. The government's relocated in the south, Nanking, and then Sichuan province. And here's Chang Dai-ch'ien. He shows up and he has these exhibits of this wonderful recovery, restoration of China's true past, of its glorious past. I think the Dunhuang moment in Zhang's life is really the moment. I mean, he was well established as an important artist, and people like Xu Peihong are calling him the greatest painter in 500 years, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this moment when he presents these Dunhuang paintings, this is what really establishes him as the #1 painter in China, I think, in my not so humble view. I think it's an important moment, and it was an important moment for China, especially during the war, during wartime. And it's for me, when I think of Chang Dai-ch'ien's life and it's so many twists and turns and accidents of chance and his this man who is really a Da-ch'ien, a great thousand Buddhist universe of a man of many faces, a man at play in the world, a Feng Liu. He's so many complex personalities all rolled into one. Very traditional with his family and with women on the one hand, right? Ooh. I hear a lot of laughter, nervous laughter in the room, right? His family, his daughters had to kowtow to him, his students had to kowtow to him. This is very traditional, very preaching dynasty. A very patriarchal man on the one hand, and yet also a man of so playful, such a playful personality, so generous, always wanting to treat people, to draw people in, to help other artists. Just extraordinarily charming, charismatic, open-hearted person, right? Also a little bit of a trickster. Huh? He's a man who had so deeply immersed himself in the traditions of Chinese painting. I would argue that perhaps with the exception of maybe Wu Hufan or even C.C. Wang, perhaps no one of his generation had seen as many paintings and had studied Chinese painting in the depth that he had. And this is very important. In my big overview of Chang Dai-ch'ien, when I think about him, one of the essential points that I want to make, that I try to make in my biography of him, as I draw together these different strands of his personality, his complex persona, is that I think he is the number one most important figure in the transmission of Chinese painting to the West. Post 1949, he is, before 1949, okay, he's number one painter in China, greatest painter in the last 500 years. Outside of China, how many people know who Chang Dai-ch'ien is? How many people have ever even heard of him? In my journey, Wayman talks about her journey with her film. I have a different journey in my book, in my work on Chang Dai-ch'ien. I remember meeting Arnold Zhang, who used to be the Sotheby's Chinese painting expert for many years, a friend and teacher of mine, who allowed me entree into the secret hidden world of auction houses and the Chinese painting world. He knew all the personalities and he gave me all the backstories of everybody that played a role in the auction world. Very helpful. But he told me a wonderful story about how when he was in grade school, Arnold is an American-born Chinese. He was asked, his teacher had made an assignment, write a paper about a famous painter that you knew. Huh? And he couldn't name a single Chinese painter. If you ask most Americans, most Westerners, name me a single Chinese painter, blank. Everybody knows Picasso. I think probably most Chinese people would know who Picasso is. How come nobody knows who Chang Dai-ch'ien is? Or at that time, anyway. Now people are starting to know. So that's a puzzle. And think about this. With all of that attention, all of that identity formation that Chang Dai-ch'ien went through, coming from a small area in Sichuan province, Nagin, going to cosmopolitan Shanghai, achieving the success that he achieved in China. Now, after 1949, he's going to Argentina? He's going to Brazil? How many people there know anything about any Chinese painter? But within 6 years, this unknown but most famous person, greatest painter in the last 500 years, who's a nobody now, reinvents himself and is suddenly having major exhibitions in Tokyo, Paris, Germany, and he arrives in the West. How did this happen? Is this magic? This is an important question, very important question. How does Chang fashion himself as an artist? How does he establish himself as an artist in the context of countries, cultures that are utterly ignorant of a painting tradition that's older than the Western painting tradition? Chinese painting has a history that is a continuous history that is much older than the very fragmented Greco-Roman tradition that goes into the Renaissance, comes down to modern times. It's not a continuous tradition. It's a very different evolution trajectory, if you will. I'm not saying one's better than the other, but both are clearly very, very important. So these moments of contact between East and West, like the Silk Road itself, transmission point from East to West, West to East. And embodied in this figure of Chang Dai-ch'ien, who comes to the West, and I would argue in my book, I'm going to really reiterate this point as much as I can, this role that he plays as the embodiment of Chinese art, Chinese culture, bringing it to the West, educating the West about Chinese art, the richness of this culture. He does this on many levels, not just as a painter, but as a collector, because he comes to the West in the 1950s with, I believe, the largest and one of the last private collections of early Chinese painting, the Dafengtang collection, right? Ever to come to the West at a time when mainland China is shut down. You can't get, no art's leaving China at that point, right? And so here he is, he's in some ways, he's coming with this amazing collection of early Chinese painting, right? That also has some of his own forgeries of early Chinese painting. And he's presenting it to the West. Here I am, look at these works. And remember, 1956, the Musée Czernuski, Musée d'Art Moderne, multiple exhibits of his work. Not only his own paintings, but his collection of early Chinese paintings and his Dunhuang murals. So the West is getting this massive immersion, sudden immersion in Chinese painting, and in many different media and many different forms. In Paris, art capital of the world, in Tokyo, right? And this is the moment, and again, to get back to the somewhat nefarious, playful, trickster side of Chang Dai-ch'ien. This is a moment when he begins selling a group of at least a dozen so-called early Chinese paintings, a Hangan painting, horse painting, to the Musée Czernuski, a Juron painting to the British Museum, several paintings of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, to the Freer Gallery in Washington, major museums, and they're his forgeries. They are not early Chinese paintings. They're his forgeries of early Chinese painting. And he's so proud that he's done this. He is so happy. He has, look what he's done. We're going to talk, I'll talk a little bit about probably the first and most, do I dare use the word notorious? No, I think it's a magnificent forgery. His Hangan painting, right? His horse and grooms Hangan painting. Now, mind you, he's doing this. How did he pull this off? Is it that Westerners are just dumb? You know, their ignorance? Well, let's think about this for a moment. He's, in a sense, this collection that he brings to the West, he's saying to the West, okay, you like China, you like Chinese art. Okay, I'm going to test you. I'm going to test you. Can you tell the pearls from the fish eyes? Huh? How do you say this in Chinese? Chang Dai-ch'ien. How did I do this? How did I do? Pearls or fish eyes? Can you tell? Can you tell the difference? Now, who is he fooling here? Let's take the Hangan as an example. I'll segue into that because I know Genwa, he really put me on the spot. Genwa likes to put me on the spot. I called him, I think it was one night ago, and he had said, "Oh, I want you to just talk about your book, you know, whatever you want." And then I called him a night ago, and he said, "No, you got to talk about the Hangan. Everybody wants to hear about the Hangan." Oh, okay. So, oh, here we go. Let's look at this beautiful, beautiful piece of work. Okay. So this is really magnificent, magnificent. Look at the seals. You know, you have these amazing seals, and you know, okay. So let's talk about this painting. First of all, what did Western or anybody really know about? Okay. Those of you who think this is a forgery, those of you who think I'm going to test your connoisseurship. Why? How do you know this is a forgery? Let's do a little.
Trembling if this is a real one. I'm gonna be trembling if this is a real one.
Oh yes. It's you can feel it.
Oh, that's the sheet.
Okay, so now mind you, you could say right now, well, that's not very nice of Chang Dai-ch'ien. You know, they throw these major exhibits of his work and he sells them this fake. You know, why did he do that? Was he being mean? What is he doing? You know how much money they paid for this in 1956? $75,000, which if you were to take the purchasing power of that today, $850,000. So for $75,000 in 1956 in France, that's a lot of money. Maybe the most amount of money ever paid for an early Chinese painting in certainly at that time. Okay, so this is and it wasn't the museum that bought this; it was the city of Paris. The whole city of Paris had to approve. It's
not the same.
Not even close.
是零的，不是模的。
Yeah, yeah.
零，这是零，是对的。
这是白描，张世正的白描。
All right, so let's think about this for a moment. Let's think about this for a moment.
让观众看一下。
Test your connoisseurship. Let me see if I can find my version of this, which is not very
Photos are
oh,
here,
okay.
so
So
we can
let's
just go
see if I can.
bit like. Oh, let me see.
I think if you X up here, I want to go to the Hangan.
Oh,
I have one that's called Hangan. Maybe.
number. I have like loaded all the paintings, all the photos here, so we can find it.
It's not even. Let's see. So,
Yes.
there we go.
Here
Okay.
we
Okay.
go.
So
Here we
I'm not
go.
very good reproduction of it, but
Okay.
you can keep your eyes focused on that for a moment. So, again, why are we looking at this other than wow? Pretty good forgery. So why is it that the museum acquired this, got the city of Paris, which was not an easy thing to do because France at that time was in a major economic recession. And here's the city of Paris, municipality of Paris, paying a huge amount of money for a Chinese painting, going to a fairly obscure museum of Chinese art, the Czerniewski Museum. It's a beautiful museum in Le Parc Monceau in Paris. And so a number of things occur to me as I spent part of last summer in Paris, and I went to the archives of Vadim Eliseev. Vadim Eliseev was a very important scholar, and he was a sinologist. He knew Chinese and Japanese. He had been a diplomat during World War II in Chengdu, had met Chang Dai-ch'ien in the 1940s, and Guo Yushou, very important personality in Zhang's life. I want to pull up a photo of, whoops, there we go. Here he is. Guo Yushou was a minister of education in the nationalist Chinese government, Republican period, a UNESCO. He was a founding member of UNESCO, director of its, he did a very important study of education needs in China for UNESCO. He was a cultural attaché. He had been educated with the Republic of China both in Paris and later in Belgium. He had been educated in the West in the 1920s. He did his thesis through the Sorbonne and the London School of Economics. He spoke French. He was a friend and patron of many, many Chinese artists who came to Paris to study. He helped their careers. He arranged exhibits for them. And Chang Dai-ch'ien referred to him as his cousin. He grew up in Sichuan province in the neighboring town, forgive my awful Chinese pronunciation, I believe it's Zuchong. It was a town very near Nagin, where Chang Dai-ch'ien's brother had taught, in fact. They were two very dear and close friends. I would argue that Chang Dai-ch'ien's career in Europe could not have happened without Guo Yushou. Guo Yushou helped him in so many ways, not only because he spoke French, but because as a diplomat and as someone who had lived in France for a long time, he knew leading intellectuals. He knew Vadim Eliseev. In fact, Vadim Eliseev had met Guo Yushou in 1944. They were very close friends. Eliseev got Guo Yushou the Légion d'honneur, the Legion of Honor award, which is very high national award for Guo Yushou for all that he had done for the Czerniewski Museum. I believe in certain ways Guo Yushou educated Vadim Eliseev about contemporary Chinese painting, because Eliseev although he was a sinologist, deeply knowledgeable about objects, he had very little knowledge of early Chinese painting at all, like many Western scholars. I think we need to appreciate the fact that really, from an art historical perspective, scholarship of early Chinese painting or of Chinese painting in general is largely a post-World War II phenomenon. The connoisseurship, the sense of the history of Chinese painting, art history of Chinese painting, does not really begin until after the Second World War. Not that there weren't important collections of Chinese painting in the West. There were. Boston had acquired an excellent collection through China trade. At the end of the 19th century, they had gotten a lot of works from Japan, important Buddhist paintings, even some Tang Dynasty paintings, wonderful collection. Nelson Atkins in Kansas City had a fairly good collection. The Met had a terrible collection, Metropolitan Museum. Really, they had been burned. An early collection, the Bar collection, was full of forgeries, not Chang Dai-ch'ien forgeries, but just poorly attributed paintings. There was not a deep level of connoisseurship and understanding of Chinese painting, particularly in the early dynasties in the West. So when people say, well, how could the Musée Czerniewski and this famous scholar Eliseev be fooled by this painting? I want to explore that. That was very interesting for me to understand why they were taken in by this, but it wasn't just the Chernuski Museum. And moreover, this Hangan painting, let's see if I can find the list of scholars who approved this painting. They were the most prominent Western Chinese painting scholars. Jan Fontaine, who became later director of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Paul Demivielle, another, but you see the orientation of Western scholarship was much more historical and less artistic. And we have another problem with Western understanding of Chinese painting. I would argue that when it comes to connoisseurship and understanding of painting, it would be unthinkable in China before the 20th century that someone would study art who was not himself a painter. So the idea of empirical, detached, scholarly understanding, studying the history of painting the way Western art historians work, some of them are artists, but not many of them. But in China, that kind of approach wouldn't have made sense. The people who knew art, who understood art, were the literati, the Wenren. That is, people like Chang Dai-ch'ien, people who were collectors, painters, poets, calligraphers. They had a certain mastery, but it's a different perspective on painting. If you're a painter, you think about art differently from how you think about it if you're outside looking in, as opposed to inside looking out. So we have this difference in scholarly approaches, a sort of Western tradition, empirical, rational. I don't want to say scientific, but based on the kinds of evidentiary, factual, contextual understandings. They have a certain, they're privileged above the subjective. The way that Chinese connoisseurs typically talk about C.C. Wang, for instance, talk about the spirit of the brushwork. You can see the identity of the artist in the brushstroke. C.C. would talk about this all the time. Wang Qi would talk about this, and to read Chang Dai-ch'ien, you read his own writings about Chinese painting. Let me quote from his preface to the Da Feng Tong. He says, "Be it calligraphy or painting, no matter how confusing or complicated the presentation before my eyes, I can unhesitatingly discern the true value. As soon as I touch the paper and ink, I can differentiate among the schools and influences. Once I have the chance to get a hold of the scrolls, I can give immediate judgment on their genuineness or fakery after I begin to unroll them. These are not at all cheating words of fantasy or exaggerations, but only my honest self-evaluation of my connoisseurship. People say that painting like mine has not existed in the past 500 years. He's talking about both his own work and his collection. They also say that in the past 500 years, there has not lived a connoisseur comparable to my humble self." Pure Chang Dai-ch'ien. He is, he's both boasting and being humble at the same time, Perfect. Just to a T. That's his personality. So proud of what he knows, because he knows more than anybody. He's going to test you. And as we read, I'm going to read you, I hope I have a little time to do this, a little bit of a chapter of my book. It's called Portrait of the Artist as a Young Forger. And it's about his years in Shanghai when he was learning to imitate, copy, and forge Shitao and Daoqi. Now, this has been a great challenge, not only to Western scholars, but also to the top connoisseurs in China. Because if you read the Chinese accounts, I'm not talking about Western accounts, but Chinese accounts by writers who knew Chang Dai-ch'ien in the 1920s. They talk about him fooling all the top experts, Wang Binhong, right, who fancied himself the #1 Shitao authority, right, and with great pride and great, again, a kind of playful trickster character. Chang Dai-ch'ien arranges a situation in a painting that totally fools Wang Binhong. So when I read these stories, these accounts, and I take them a little bit as not as absolute fact. I'm not interested in that. They're part of the mythology of the persona, part of the identity that Zhang is fashioning for himself in Shanghai in the 1920s as the #1 connoisseur in the last 500 years. And he does that by fooling everybody around him. Everybody. You think you know about Shitao? No, you don't know. Look at this. What do you think of this? Think that's good? Yes, I have to own that. I have to have that. Zhang Dai comes to him a little later and says, you bought that painting, but here's my secret seal. 1967 or 68, there was a large symposium at University of Michigan about the paintings of Shitao. Another of my mentors in Chinese painting, Wu Tung, who was curator of Chinese art at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. I worked with him for 2 years editing their catalog of their collection, and I learned a lot about connoisseurship from Wu Tung. Chang Dai-ch'ien, when he met him, he had tried to recruit Wu Tung to go to Brazil and work with him because he knew Wu Tung was a very good calligrapher and had a lot of knowledge. Wu Tung had been a journalist himself in Taiwan. And when he wanted to write about forgeries, Zhang's forgeries, he had to use an assumed name because you couldn't talk openly about Chang Dai-ch'ien's forgeries in Taiwan in the early 60s and late 50s. It just, you didn't say that about Chang Dai-ch'ien. There's been a sea change in how people view the forgeries. That's actually a very interesting part of the ethnography of this transmission of Chinese painting to the West that is fascinating to me. The sort of tentativeness. Everybody goes, oh, forgery, we can't talk about that. We can't really say. There's social issues that attend to that are part and parcel of the very professionalized world of art, the art market in the West, and also in China. I think about that a lot, particularly in the context of Shanghai in the 1920s. What was it like to become a painter in Shanghai? How do you establish yourself? How did Chang Dai-ch'ien, coming from Nagin with an incomplete middle school education, he did not finish middle school, right? Now we're told his mother was a painter and taught him how to paint. He goes to Shanghai, he arrives in Shanghai, and immediately he is in the milieu of, first of all, he has 2 important teachers, Zhang Xi and Li Ruiqing, also known as Taoist Li. So these are 2, who are these people? They're ex-officers of the court. They were in the Manchu dynasty, and they're known, certainly Li Ruiqing, for seal script. They're experts in the ancient forms of calligraphy, the tortoiseshell used for divination and on the stelae. And Chang Dai-ch'ien is studying, why? This is his entry point. What does this have to do with Shitao? But here he is studying, learning from these 2 men. Both of them turn out to be very interested in the 17th century individualists, Shitao, Bada Shanghai. They are among the top connoisseurs of these. And so very quickly, Chang Dai-ch'ien learns not only, just one little footnote about why is he studying this most ancient form of calligraphy, seal script? Because again, this is this This is something that's happening in Republican China. The rediscovery of China's past in its most, to use the word primitive again, its most original form. This is calligraphy in its most expressive form. Li Ruiqing and Zhang Xi saw this kind of calligraphy as very expressive, in the same way that the individualists, Shitao, Bada Shanren, are also seen as very expressive. They're also Zen monk painters. They're Ming, Shitao was a Ming prince who followed Ming dynasty. He becomes a Chan Buddhist to kind of hide himself, although he does go back to the court. And the other thing that's going on in Shanghai at this time, not only is there an interest in the 17th century painters, right? The Japanese are really interested in Shitao. Why? Because they're Buddhist painters. And there's something about them. They have a certain quality to them. There's a huge market for Shitao and Bada Shanren. Those paintings will sell for good money, and Dai-ch'ien and his the circle of people, including some of Li Ruiqing's Taoist Li's family, were involved in a kind of forgery group. Fushan Studies of Connoisseurship, Wen Fong to some extent has done some good work talking about this circle, but they were by no means the only group of people doing forgeries of Shitao in Shanghai in the 1920s. There was a market for this. So I'm exploring this because, again, I want to understand, how did Dai-ch'ien achieve the kind of prominence that he did so quickly, coming from where he came from? He's suddenly, he's in the middle of Shanghai, and just as Guo Yushou was so important for Zhang Dai-ch'ien's career in, I want to get to the Li, you show, yes, the Carter Road. So here is Dai-ch'ien with in the French concession at the home of the Li family. The Li family, very prominent, very powerful, very wealthy Ningbo merchant family. They were bankers. They ran the wealthiest banks in Shanghai. They were some of the Li family members had businesses in Germany, pharmaceutical businesses. And here's Zhang Dai-ch'ien at their home, and I've been to this home. I've been to this house in Shanghai. 80 Carter Road, I believe, was the address. And here is Zhang Dai-ch'ien with, you'll see, I believe, Li Tzu-han. Is that him there? Yeah, that's Li Tzu-han. Yeah. Li Tzu-han was with his sister. Let's go to Li Qiuchun.
Next.
Yeah, this is Li Qiuchun. Li Qiuchun and Li Tzu-han were, in their day, very prominent Shanghainese painters and artists. Li Qiuchun started one of the first women's painting societies, calligraphy societies, in Shanghai. Yeah, thank you. Forgive my abysmal Chinese pronunciation. She was a really important figure and very close to Zhang Dai-ch'ien. In fact, the Li family wanted Zhang Dai-ch'ien to marry her. He didn't want to do that. I mean, there have been rumors that they were romantically involved. Whatever the story of all of that, what's really important here is that you see Zhang Dai-ch'ien, again, he's coming from a family of broken gentry in Sichuan province, and suddenly he's with one of the wealthiest families in Shanghai. Shanghai was awash in painting societies and clubs. Exactly. And this becomes the Li family house becomes the center of the Dafengtang studio. All of Zhang's students gather there. I think I have another, where's the other photo? Yeah, the big photo of the Li family house.
No,
No.
I think it's here.
There we go. You'll help me identify some of these people. You see Chang Dai-ch'ien and with him Xu Wenpo, his fourth wife next to her. Li Tzu-han, third from the left over there. And Li Shou-chun, I believe, is in this, but there's also, you mentioned, you pointed out one other person.
Oh, Mei Lanfeng?
Yeah.
The
Mei
the
Lanfeng,
opera singer.
the Chinese opera. I mean, look, he's with superstars. Chang Dai-ch'ien is with superstars. He's with the cultural elite of Shanghai at this period. So how did he do this? How did he do this? Well, first of all, he's recognized.
Yeah, this is Fu Wenyan with the
Ah.
glasses on. Yeah.
So the painting at the very back, painting in the very back there of the pine tree, painted by
Fu Wenyan. It's the descent.
yes. Yes, I think that this photograph, I'm fairly certain, is mostly Da Fengtang students with some Li family members mixed in. Li Tzu-han is third from the end on this side. So, again, the centrality, the kind of in studying in studying artistic, maybe drink some water here. I think a lot about this question of social milieu in the formation of artists, because again, I'm working against a kind of Western cliche and a stereotype of the artist as this lone figure who lives in a garret. The kind of image of the artist that we have with Van Gogh, or someone who is never famous in their time, but is just this. I mean, Michelangelo arguably was such a person, except no, Michelangelo had very powerful, wealthy people and popes backing him. Chang Dai-ch'ien also had very powerful people who believed in him and helped his career, helped advance his aims, because they recognized his talent and they admired him. And he was a generous, charismatic personality, but above all, he was exceptionally talented and brilliant in his appreciation of traditional Chinese painting, his understanding of it. They saw this man, there's something very special about Chang Dai-ch'ien in this, and they helped build his career. There's no question about the importance of the Li family's. The very first exhibit that Chang Dai-ch'ien held in Shanghai is at the Ningbo Merchants Guild. And these merchant guilds, again, you have what was Shanghai in the 1920s? Well, it was really a kind of exceptional place. On the one hand, you have a semi-colonial city, French concession, German concession, American concession. Shanghai had been divided up after the Boxer Rebellion. The Europeans colonized parts of Shanghai. So it's already an internationalized cosmopolitan city on the one hand, right? Then you have a group of entrepreneurs, nouveau riche, and wealth coming out of Ningpo, which is very important, that form the, you have figures like Wang Yiting, the painter Wang Yiting, everybody, yeah. Here's a very fabulously wealthy man who's also a painter, who's also a patron of the arts, who's doing what Guo Yusho did for Chang Dai-ch'ien, advancing painting societies, promoting art, as well as his own art. I mean, he's part of the Shanghai School of Painters, the Hai-Pai, call them that. There's the Shanghai clique of artists and cultural figures. And in this milieu, I think about also a third element that's very important in Shanghai, which is the Green Gang. Du Yue Sheng. Du Yuesheng. Now, is there a relationship of Chang Dai-ch'ien with Du Yuesheng? Most certainly. 1946. This gets kind of murky, folks, so get ready. You're going to hear some surprises here. Du Yuesheng, was a totally uneducated, illiterate man who became arguably one of the most powerful people in Shanghai. Because of the Green Gang and because of what the Green Gang grew to control, mostly we associate Du Yuesheng with the opium traffic, and yet he becomes commissioner of opium under the Republican government. Very important to Chiang Kai-shek in suppressing the communists in Shanghai, right? But he's also controlling shipping. He's controlling a lot of the river transport. It becomes a very important person. And as he rises in Shanghainese society, he needs to kind of clean up his act, right? So he hires a very prominent calligrapher and scholar by the name of Yang Du, to write his biography. And because Yang Du, at a certain point, as many prominent Shanghainese did to establish themselves, he sponsored a 1-week celebration of Du Yuesheng. And so he had very prominent calligraphers, Yang Du, scholars say marvelous things about Du Yuesheng, right? And there was parades. I mean, there are photographs of this. And, this is a gangster who becomes a central figure in the Republican government's control of Shanghai. They need him to control things politically. So he's trying to basically, what would be the term for this? Reinvent himself as a respectable gangster friend. So 1946, Chang Dai-ch'ien had a big exhibit in Shanghai, and I would say roughly a third of the paintings were bought by Du Yuesheng. So, I can show you newspaper articles that document this, but there's another piece of this that gets to be interesting. Yang Du's daughter, very left wing, joins the Communist Party, marries Guo Yuzhou. So there is this. Now, there's been a lot of speculation about Yang Du himself, whether he was not a secret communist, that Zhou Enlai had enlisted him to spy on Du Yuesheng, because they knew Du Yuesheng was a very powerful person. You don't want to mess with this man, right? So the communists needed, especially after the suppression of the communists in Shanghai, they needed someone on the inside. This is speculation, but I've done a fair amount of research about Du Yuesheng, social historians, a number of UC Berkeley social historians who've written about the influence of the Green Gang in Shanghai. There's a lot of literature, and some people speculate that Yang Du, in fact, was a member of the Communist Party. When Guo Yuzhou became minister of UNESCO minister, his wife and child went back to the mainland, which gives rise to another form of speculation, because Guo Yuzhou himself in the 1960s is arrested in Switzerland as a spy for mainland China and goes back to the mainland. Devastating moment for Chang Dai-ch'ien. The end of his European, this is his closest friend, his brother, referred to him as his brother, cousin. So this is part of the mystery. We don't really know. I don't myself believe that Guo Yuzhou was a spy. I don't think he had the talent for that. And I think he basically was compromised to embarrass Republican China, certain officials in the Kuomintang, that he was kind of, he was caught in Switzerland giving either money or documents to a Chinese Secret Service, a mainland Chinese, high-level mainland Chinese Secret Service agent. He was then transported back to Paris, kept in the the PRC's embassy in Paris, and ultimately went back to the mainland. This was really a severe blow to Chang Dai-ch'ien, both personally, because they were so close. And it also had certain, I think, political implications for Zhang himself, because, you know, his closest friend, was he in fact a spy? How long was he a spy, or what information was he passing about Chang Dai-ch'ien? I think the real big fish that the mainland wanted was Chang Dai-ch'ien. They wanted him to go back to the mainland. And it's quite possible they were using Guo Yushou in a certain way to embarrass, compromise Chang Dai-ch'ien himself. I have no doubt that Chang Dai-ch'ien would, you know, he despised the communists. He did not. First of all, what happened to the Li family? There was some evidence that Li Qiuchun committed suicide during the Cultural Revolution. I've seen that information passed along. I mean, these are his closest friends. His family suffered. He would not have gone back to the mainland. At the same time, it's his homeland. It's his homeland. He has a nostalgia for his homeland. Of course, he wants to go back, but he can't. And I think that's something he and Guo shared. There's a wonderful, in Wei Min's film, there's an album that Chang Dai-ch'ien, thank you, 8 scenes of say it, Sejun. And they're all places that these two men knew and saw. And it's a beautiful album, and it's full of this nostalgia, this desire to go home, but they can't. Chang Dai-ch'ien can't go back, and that's, again, this is another piece of his life that I think is so important, is this traumatic, terrible situation of so many Chinese whose families were divided, separated after 1949. You know, this was politically exploited on both sides of the Taiwan Straits, you know, very problematic. I remember in the 1980s, I believe, 1980s, when John Crawford had a symposium, gave his collection of Chinese painting, excuse me, to the Metropolitan Museum. There was a big international symposium. For the first time, scholars, Chinese painting scholars from the mainland and Taiwan, were brought together for this symposium. And I remember going to a luncheon, and the PRC people and the Taiwanese people would not sit at the same table. Many of them had family who had fought on opposite sides of the Civil War. You couldn't do that then. How painful, how difficult. You know, this is one country, but divided, separated because of politics. And there is a strand of that story in Chang Dai-ch'ien's life that needs to be told. And it operates on many levels, and it's a piece of his story that, again, Westerners are not, it's difficult for Westerners to understand that. I mean, we live in a very divided world, not just Chinese families that are separated, Palestinians and Israelis, Ukraine. We live in a world where politicians divide us every day. And this trauma has done so much harm to innocent people, to families. So again, I look at this story of Guo Yushou and Chang Dai-ch'ien as kind of emblematic of that, and also as Wei Min's wonderful documentary of Color Inc. You see it in Chang Dai-ch'ien's family. When some of his relatives from the mainland finally get to meet grandpa, you know, in Germany for his birthday. I mean, it's so poignant. I just so admire you for capturing that, because it's again, it's part, we think of artists as these, you know, we inflate their identity, because they're celebrities, they're superstars. We don't see the reality sometimes because we idealize them so much. You know, and it's true both in China and in the West. We do this. We don't see the milieu. We don't see the lived world of these artists. And as Wei Min did it beautifully in her film, and I'm trying to capture some of that in my book as well, because it's such an important. It humanizes the artist to know this, to know their social networks, to know that it you know, takes a village to raise a child. You know, it takes a whole group of people to make an artist. You know, yes, the artist does the work, and is when we use the word genius, we somehow we particularize them in a certain way that in some sense robs them of their humanity. By making them so exceptional, we lose something. So I think it's important to bring that back, to bring that understanding back to as we think about what does it mean to be an artist? How does one become an artist? Yes, thank you. Let's see. Maybe I take a little break here and see if you have any questions you want to ask me, and then I'll pick up again. Is there anything more? I know I've been rambling all over the universe of the Dai-ch'ien universe. So much to say about him. I also want to talk about his brother, Shansi, very important figure in Chang Dai-ch'ien's life. Again, neglected, I think, somewhat forgotten, but played such an important role in some ways in laying the groundwork for what Chang Dai-ch'ien later becomes. A very heroic figure, very important figure. But please, questions. And if do we have a way of hearing from people who are watching this online? Yes.
There are question asked.
Please.
Maybe this also think about, you know, a lot of people here. Since Republic of China become people's
Yes.
in the early years, a lot of people, the scholars, the intellectual, is educated in Republic of China,
Yes.
but they moved to People's Republic.
Yes.
Then, since this Red China take over China, there is no weird culture or master like in the Bingguo or the Republic here. Like Chang Dai-ch'ien or Qi Beishi, a lot of this was grow out of that,
Yes.
what they call the turmoil soil, but
Yes.
it's more traditional China.
Yes.
Has not imported the Marxism or Leninism. And that pure China actually helped a lot of master grow. And after the People's Republic of China, there was a master. You look at the photography, the painting,
Yeah.
they don't have that taste. Traditional way. What do you think about this difference?
Well, I think you're asking something really, really important. It's a very important question because why? Why is there no master?
Yeah.
And part of it is again, Marxism itself denounces elites because it tries to replace elite in a Maoist revolution or a Russian revolution with a political elite. That's where the power is. So these people like the Li family, wealthy merchants, right, who are patrons of the arts, who are cultivating an elite class of people, and making artists embrace the idea that they're special. Well, you create a social order where everybody's supposed to be equal, right? There's no more excellence. You have to be careful about being too excellent. You can't show off. I mean, Chang Dai-ch'ien, you know, among other things, he's a big show off. He doesn't lie about, you know, this is the interesting thing about Chang Dai-ch'ien. Gustave Flaubert, great French writer, said, forgers always work in dark cellars. Not Chang Dai-ch'ien. He works in the open. He's proud of his forgeries. He's proud of what he knows. He never denied that he did forgeries. He boasted of it because he had that kind of, in some ways, I hope I'm not insulting anybody by saying this, but he's not, yes, he's a Confucian when it comes to his family, but in his persona, his artistic persona, he's not Confucian. He's a Taoist. He's a trickster. He's playing with you, with himself, with everybody. So in a world that is so socially controlled as Maoist China was, it's much harder for artists. And I mean, look what happened in the Cultural Revolution, again. So I think there's an argument to be made that there is some value in elitism. In a certain, of course, that can become extreme and oppressive also, and distorted also. But, in Spanish, you say cada su sitio. Everybody has their place. Everybody has their talent. Everybody has their gift, right? Each one of us has a gift. We need to live in a world where those things are celebrated, honored, encouraged, nurtured. And Chang Dai-ch'ien could not arise in PRC. I don't think. I don't think that would be possible. Yeah. Other questions, please. Is there any way we can get people online to ask questions?
Carl, in 1997, you published that essay on the New York Magazine.
Yes.
Initial the debate of the river banks.
Yes.
In 1999, the Metropolitan.
Yes.
So my question is, do you still believe the piece of Metropolitan Museum's collection?
The Dongyuan.
Yeah, Dongyuan piece. Do you still believe that one was by the hand of Chang Dai-ch'ien or not?
Well, let me answer that. I'm going to dance around the question a little bit. First of all, my article did not say it was a forgery. What I said was, the Met just acquired the Mona Lisa of Chinese painting from C.C. Wang, right? And it's put on the front pages of the New York Times, right? As the Mona Lisa. This is the first Chinese painting ever to be on the front page of the New York Times. Pretty significant. Now, keep in mind that the publisher, Sulzberger of the New York Times, was also chairman of the acquisitions committee at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I knew, because I knew James Cahill very well, and had read his Index of Early Chinese Painting, that a number of scholars in the field did not accept that attribution, but believed it was a modern fabrication by Chang Dai-ch'ien. Okay. Cahill believed that. Hironobu Kohara, leading Japanese expert of Chinese painting, had written several articles about this. The New York Times didn't report that. So I wrote the New Yorker piece not to say this is nonsense, it's a forgery, but just to draw attention to the fact that there's a difference of opinion about this. Let's be honest here, okay? Number one. And number two, I knew enough about the Metropolitan Museum, Fong Wen, and other troubled problems with certain paintings they had acquired. I knew enough to know that the painting, which came from C.C. Wang, a brilliant, brilliant artist, connoisseur. I traveled to mainland China with C.C. Wang. We went to Huangshan together. He was carried up in a sedan chair. I knew his family. My relatives lived in the same building, as I mentioned to you, as he. And, C.C. Wang is not someone whose opinions are to be disregarded. He was the #1 Chinese painting expert at the Met, at Sotheby's for many years. He's deeply embedded in this transmission of Chinese painting to the West. He's also sold many of Chang Dai-ch'ien's paintings, including some forgeries. So there's a difference of opinion, but what I also knew is that Feng Wen's wife's family, Oscar Tong, they got a big tax write-off for this painting. And that also was not reported by the New York Times. So again, I want to go back to something, just to slightly correct your question. I didn't say, I don't consider myself a connoisseur. I'm not. I leave that for people to debate. But that little article, and it wasn't very long, got translated and it caused a lot of trouble. And the Met, slightly embarrassed by it, convened a symposium. Here I'll start to really answer your question. And it brought together a bunch of international scholars, including Hironobu Kohara, James Cahill on one side of the fence, Sherman Lee, who at that point, unfortunately, he had been director of the Cleveland Art Museum and made the statement, anybody who thinks this Dong Yuan is a 10th century painting should be kicked out of graduate school. They should, go back to grade school. It's a Chang Dai-ch'ien forgery. Sherman Lee and Wen Fong had written articles together on Chinese painting. So that's a difference of opinion there. And then the other side, many of Wen Fong's students, many scholars brought in from China, who said, no, this is right. James, this is a Dong Yuan painting. So there's a debate, there's a symposium. Cahill gives his paper, and I would urge everybody in this room who's interested in this painting to read that paper carefully. It's a 14-point prosecution of Dong Yuan, of the painting of the riverbank, and Cahill believes firmly that it's Chang Dai-ch'ien, and he raises 14 points. My response to you is that in that symposium, none of those points were addressed. And there was a fair degree, you have to understand that James Cahill, he's the #1 Western scholar of Chinese painting on the left coast. Wen Fong is the #1 Chinese-born expert in Chinese painting, Princeton University, Metropolitan Museum, well-heeled collectors, Douglas Dillon, former Secretary of Treasury of the United States. They're all pro Dong Yuan, and there was kind of a ganging up on Cahill. Michael Hearn said, oh, this is Jim in his dotage, pointing fingers. He was kind of personally insulting to James Cahill. So I don't think the symposium resolved the issue. I would say that of the papers that I read, Cahill's is the most persuasive and I'm not saying this as a connoisseur, I'm saying this as a rhetorician. When I look at the arguments that are presented for or against, Cahill's paper is the most convincing to me of all of those papers. Now, I am not a connoisseur. I would never, you shouldn't take my word for anything else other than I was trying to report the facts in the New Yorker and tell a bigger story than what the New York Times was telling. I think that needed to be stated publicly that there was a difference of opinion. And another piece of information that's important in all of this, some of you may know a wonderful sinologist by the name of Simon Leys. Simon Leys was a Belgian sinologist who translated Chatel's treatise on painting. Wonderful, the most well-researched translation of that commentary on that treatise. Simon Leys said something very important to me once. He said, art history is the only field in the humanities where a scholar's judgment has immediate monetary impact. If a scholar says a painting is genuine, it's worth one set of money. If he says it's fish eyes rather than pearls, it's worth a much lower amount of money. So that's an interesting thing to throw into the mix here. These wars of attribution that have occurred in not just in Chinese painting. You have this Bernard Berenson, Duveen, brought huge collections of supposedly Renaissance paintings sold to Isabella Student Gardner, many of which were forgeries, were not original Renaissance works. You have these battles of connoisseurship. It's an interesting piece of the what I would call ethnography of art history. And so, you know, my answer to your question is, I don't feel I have enough knowledge to say, number one. But I am dubious about it, particularly about the provenance of the painting, the exchange of paintings that enabled Chang Dai-ch'ien to get what would have been a much more valuable painting than the one he traded for. And the sudden appearance of this painting in the 20th century, mid-20th century, from an artist of whom there are so few, like Hangan, original works. You know, one of the reasons that the Musée Czerniewski was fooled by the Hangan is there was only really one other painting out there, Night Shining White, Percival David collection, now in the Metropolitan Museum, reasonably attributed to Hangan. So how do you say that suddenly a new Hangan appears? Oh, oh, interesting. It has the same seals on it that Night Shining White has, formerly in the collection of Pushinyu, Puru, right? A member of a cousin of the last emperor of China, major collector of Chinese painting, longtime friend of Chang Dai-ch'ien, a man well known for writing, giving attribution to paintings that he knew were forgeries. He did that as a favor for Chang Dai-ch'ien. And he inscribed one of the colophons to Chang Dai-ch'ien's forgery. And he created this story about the Hangan painting, where it came from, how it was discovered. I'll read you, if you want, I can read you what Puru wrote. And it's this completely absurd story. Completely absurd story that, you know, claims that, oh, this painting had been deposited in Dunhuang in the Sung dynasty by an official who was making a homage, and there's that seal that shows that commissioner's authentication of the painting. It stayed in Dunhuang in a very tattered form for 1,000 years, or no, I'm sorry, not 1,000 years, from the Sung dynasty down to 1900. Yeah, 1,000 years. It's up in Dunhuang. That's why it has so few seals on it, just 20 seals on it. But some of the seals are the same ones as on Night Shining White, which happens to belong to Puru. And Puru is writing the colophon, authenticating Chang Dai-ch'ien's forgery, right? And he's saying, okay, so there was this painting, it's up there in 1900. Someone discovered it. It was very tattered. The silk was torn. It made its way to Beijing. Someone in the imperial family brought it to me. It was sent to Japan to be remounted. It was done there in Japan. And of course, a lot of Chang Dai-ch'ien's forgeries were remounted in Japan. Why? Because the mounting with the beautiful silk and the rollers with the copper beautiful rollers made it look like it was in an old Japanese collection for many generations. It gave it a sort of patina of age. And Chang Dai-ch'ien did this with a whole group of his forgeries that were sold, British Museum, Boston Museum of Fine Arts. At this period in the mid-1950s, when he needs money, he's moving to Brazil, he's moving to South America. I mean, Chang Dai-ch'ien is often described as rich as a king, poor as a beggar, because he's spending money all the time, buying paintings. He needs lots of money. And he did these forgeries because this particular group of forgeries, early 10th, 11th century paintings that he did that were sold, the Tang paintings that he did. There's a group of probably a dozen of these that were made in the 50s, 1950s, as he was becoming famous in the West at a time. Chang Dai-ch'ien knew his audience very well at a time when, again, connoisseurship of Chinese painting in the West was at a very primitive level, very low level. It was easy to have these collectors buy these and museums buy these paintings. It's part of the story. Did I answer your question? Not really. Let me show a few more of these so that you let's see here. So this is one that was sold to the Freer Gallery, Three Worthies of Wu, around the same time.
Yeah, it's easy can tell the fake.
How do you know? Tell me, how do you know?
Yeah, you can the figure's face.
Mm.
Yeah, it's a typical Chang Dai-ch'ien.
Yeah, people say that looks like Chang Dai-ch'ien. Yes, so there's that one. This is a scroll that was sold to the. It's actually in color. This is a very poor reproduction, but this is a kind of a Vimalakirti Dunhuang. This was sold in 1958 to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. It goes by the name of Bodhisattva, surrounded by three Bodhisattvas surrounding. And I think this is a kind of Vimalakirti-like figure. This was sold to Boston. And let's see if I have any others. That's the Hangan. This is also Three Worthies of Wu sold to the Freer. I mean, you can see the drapery, you know, it's kind of a little bit like the copies, the Dunhuang copies that Dai-ch'ien did in Dunhuang. Very colorful, very, you know, beautifully drawn, but not the of the period of which it purportedly derives. Let's see if I can find three.
The piece was attributed to Dongyuan, the Dongyuan piece at the Met.
Yeah.
I don't have a photograph of that. Do you?
I
Wonderful. You know, part of the problem with some of these, when I do black and white reproductions of them, they can be very dark and it's very hard to read them. So it's hard to get good photographs of these. You know, one that the Dongyuan painting, when the Met first exhibited this, they took a forgery that Chang Dai-ch'ien did of a Juran painting that was sold to the Juran that Michael Sullivan had written up as an original Juran painting in Burlington magazine. It's now generally known to be a Chang Dai-ch'ien forgery. And they put the two next to each other, the Dunyuan and the Juran, and they're very, very different. And the Met did that deliberately to say, no, you see, the Juran's obviously a Chang Dai-ch'ien forgery. The Dunyuan is not. This is Dongyuan. Dongyuan. I'm not going to express I have a viewpoint, but I think you need to, I really recommend that you read James Cahill's article. You can find it online. When Fushan did his big exhibition at the Sackler Museum of Chang Dai-ch'ien's work, he has a list at the end of that catalog of about a dozen paintings that are generally agreed on as among scholars today as Chang Dai-ch'ien forgeries. I think that list is minimal. If you go online and you find James Cahill's website about Chang Dai-ch'ien's forgeries, you'll see twice the number of early dynastic Chinese paintings, 24 of them. And he has a paragraph about each of them. And he talks about how they were sold, who sold them, why he thinks it's a forgery. And then there's a separate piece about the Dongyuan that is in the book. I believe it's in this book. It's his 14 points of why he thinks the Dong Yuan is a Chang Dai-ch'ien forgery. Now, this painting, I should say some interesting things about it. It was in C.C. Wang's collection for a long time. And as I say, C.C. Wang sold it to the Met through the Oscar Tang Foundation. C.C. used this painting. It was a teaching painting. He said, you want to understand the brushwork of this artist? This is the #1 Dong Yuan in the world. And he would take many of Wenfang's students, including, well, not Wenfang students. Arnold Zhang was very close to C.C. Wang. He would go, they would study this painting. It was his teach. C.C. believed in this painting, absolutely believed in this painting. And he used it as a kind of instructional piece to understand the artist Dong Yuan. Again, an artist of whom there are maybe 2 or 3 probably original works. So, you know, it's to make stylistic, definitive statements about the genuineness, the authenticity of the painting is complex. The kinds of arguments, if I'm thinking of this rhetorically, the kinds of arguments that arise in connoisseurship, you have to talk about 2 separate things. On the one hand, there's authenticity. Okay, the facts. Who painted it? When was it painted? Provenance of the painting. I call that a summative argument. That's an argument based on factual information. But then there's quality, the quality of the painting. Well, quality is a separate question from authenticity. That's arguments that are used about quality are normative arguments. They're value judgments. I think Dong Yuan, this is the most beautiful Dong Yuan painting out there. Okay, that's a point of view. You can't establish that. You can't resolve that issue of quality. It's separate from the issue of authenticity. People confuse them a lot of the times, but they're 2 separate concerns. Now, can we establish, using summative factual information, can we definitively say the Dong Yuan is Dong Yuan or it's Chang Dai-ch'ien? How do you do that? I don't think there's enough information. We don't know enough yet. You know, it took a long time to sort out the problem of fake Vermeers done by Han van Meegeren. There were many people who said, no, these are genuine Vermeers. And that was believed for about a decade. There were people who argued that. And then slowly in time, the truth emerged. Going back to Chang Dai-ch'ien's propensity for believing he's the top connoisseur in the world, in 1967 at this Chateau exhibition in Michigan, Chang Dai-ch'ien came. There was a room full of Chateau paintings. He's going around the room. Ah, I did that one. That's mine. Oh, that's mine. That's mine. But sometimes he would do this with paintings that he could not possibly have done because they had been in a family before Chang Dai-ch'ien's birth. He could not have done that forge, but he liked to confuse people. He just did. You know, he liked to. He was a very playful man, and Chateau was. You know, he certainly saw himself as #1 Chateau expert in the world, and he had convincing reasons to believe that. So it's hard to know sometimes. I don't think the question of the Dong Yuan has been settled. I really don't.
Any questions?
Yes.
No, I have a question about Chang Dai-ch'ien, his style, because as I know, most of the artists, the painters in East, West, they all that you have to create a style for yourself and continue to develop the step by step from the to the life. not like a Chang Dai-ch'ien. When he was in the early age, he learned the kind of traditional from Recipient and
Shang-Chi, yeah.
yeah. And then he, at that time, he was still in Shanghai, right?
Yes,
And he learned 石套
yes,
and make it.
right.
A lot of people believe that his painting is actually is a swell painting. So then he went to Japan,
Yes,
learned Japanese painting,
yes,
like Fu Baoshi.
Yeah.
He went to Japan and learned Japanese kind of use the kind of washing ink, continue the whole life, create his style. And Chang Dai-ch'ien learned and then forgot it. Went to Dunhuang, learned a lot of Dunhuang
Tang,
style.
right. Yes.
And then
His style changes again.
yes, that is not has nothing to do with what he learned from in the early ages.
That's right. That's
And
right.
then he went to well, after 1942, 43.
Yes,
Came back. He went to Shanghai again.
Again.
And then he went to. In 1945, he went to
Beijing again.
Beijing, and then
And
then
what's
he went
going
to-
on there? What's going, you're on to something very important here, which
Yeah.
is that his style grows and changes.
and then
And changes. And so when he goes to Beijing, he's suddenly getting interested in early Chinese Song painting.
Yeah,
And so he starts studying the brushwork. He starts doing the
Yeah,
same thing he
yeah,
did at Dunhuang. He's trying to, in his own way, do something very traditional,
yeah, and he
which
went
is to study the whole
Western
master.
world.
And he sees Western art, he sees Impressionist art, and he
Yeah,
starts experiencing splash color, homo fa. Yeah,
So what do you think is this good for the modern artist?
I think
Change all the
that,
time,
I think that's just his nature. I think, there's no one way to be an artist. Some artists do have this trajectory where they evolve one style.
Yeah, but the traditional.
Or not, or they find their own voice and they paint. I mean, we can think of many, Mark Rothko, the color field painter.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
he could still a lot of paintings. But for the other artists, they have a different style. They could not sell painting. They have to keep this.
Well, that's an interesting question, according to Fushan, Chang Dai-ch'ien painted over 40,000 paintings in his lifetime. Think
Yeah.
about that. 40,000 paintings.
40,000.
I mean, they can't all be the same quality. They're not all the same style. And because he was so popular and because his paintings were so valuable, he was constantly being asked,
Yeah.
oh, I want one of those. I want one of those. Please do that for me. Do that for me. So he did a lot
So
of
he's
work that
very
was,
special.
he did a lot of work that he did very quickly. And then there's work he did that was very serious.
Yeah.
Like the Yangtze River painting, or Lushan too, the big paintings that he did.
But
And
most people believe that he could sell paintings because it is an association. He has
Yes.
a lot of rich friends, high
high officials.
officials, so they can support him. The other people
Can't do that.
can do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he's lucky, right?
Well, he's Chang Dai-ch'ien. I mean, this is his gift. And you could say, what's the real Chang Dai-ch'ien? What's the real one? Is there one? He's so technically, he could do anything as a painter.
Yeah, like
Really, and he's like Franz Liszt, the pianist, the
Yeah.
composer. He's technically just unbelievably well, superstar. There are artists like that.
the in Dunhuang.
Yes,
He brought about 20 friends. Go when they're together. And they also painters.
yes,
So they helped him to paint and
Yes.
to copy, to,
yes.
to take out the
There's something,
layers.
there's something very performative
Yeah. So-
about his art. He performs. He's like a performer, like an opera singer, you know? He likes that. He wants that attention.
So he's a very special guy.
Very special guy. He is.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I've been talking now for 2 hours and I think I'm running out of.
Can you share all the photos?
Tell me how to do that. Oh, one more time, once more. Show me.
I like to see more.
Yeah, five.
Yeah, this one. Oh,
Yeah,
no, there's another one, 6.
Okay, so another six
Six.
with four. Yeah. Oh.
Very important, very important.
Wow.
So here we have, I didn't talk about Li Ai. So remember the Li family. So Li Ai became Chang Dai-ch'ien's student and was romantically involved with Guo Yushu. Whenever Guo Yushu would go to Switzerland, he would visit Li Ai. And Chang Dai-ch'ien loved the Swiss landscape. And this is Walensee, and as in Wayman's film, again, he did a number of beautiful splash color Swiss paintings of various scenes. You know, he just loved nature. He loved landscapes, and this was kind of new to him. This is a new kind. The Swiss Alps and lakes were in some ways painting that, and I think Guo Yushu pushed him to do this. It changed the way, because it was a new kind of landscape, mountainous landscape. It changed the way he painted. And here they are, the three of them traveling together. I think I have another. Should have another. Is this-
7? Can you click 7?
Just click it.
Yeah.
This is Li Ai and her student.
Beautifully.
She was one of the first people I interviewed in Europe. I went to Blonay where she lived, and you know, this beautiful woman dressed in traditional Chinese robes greets me, takes me to this little pavilion, and serves me this beautiful lotus cake that she had made.
Yeah, her curriculum is pretty naive. Style, which is actually-
Well, one reason for that, she didn't speak Chinese.
Really?
No.
Yeah.
She was sent by the Li family at a very young age to Germany and never really learned Chinese.
Okay, next one. Hey,
Exactly.
hey.
Good.
This is
Yes, this one was taken in Paris,
yes.
but his Tom Phelan's studio.
I didn't speak about Shansi. He's so important in Chang Dai-ch'ien's life. You know, this is a man, two relatives of Chang Dai-ch'ien were very important in the anti-Manchu uprisings in Sichuan province. One of the, what are they, the 67 martyrs of in Canton in Guangdong. There's a monument. One of a relative of Zhang's mother was very active in overthrowing the Manchu government. Zhang Shansi himself was a general in the Sichuanese army. There was a group called the Railway Protection League. There was a protest against the Manchus, and Zhang Shansi was very active in that. So active, in fact, that because some of the warlords who took over afterwards destroyed the family business, the salt business that they were involved in. Shansi had to leave China. He joined the Tongmenghui, Sun Yat-sen's group in Japan. So this is a man of substantial political, he's a revolutionary, early revolutionary, Chang Shansi. And when Yuan Shikai came to power, he was opposed to Yuan Shikai and again had to leave China. And Chang Dai-ch'ien was sent to Japan with him to start a new business, supposedly a textile dyeing business. Shansi, during the Sino-Japanese War, was outraged at the invasion, and he was sent to the United States to raise war relief money for China. Okay, so he comes to the United States and he goes to the White House. He's invited to the White House, and he paints a tiger for Eleanor Roosevelt. It's in the White House. He also goes to Fordham University. At this point, he had converted to Catholicism, and he went to Fordham University and did a series of religious paintings that are in Fordham University's collection. He went to the Walt Disney Studios. There's you know the flying tigers. Some people say because Chang Shansi,
Can you show the more?
yeah, Shansi is very famous for painting tigers. One of his most famous paintings is of a tiger or a lion on top of Mount Fuji, and it's titled "Roar, China, Roar," and it's an anti-Japanese painting. He's saying, "Arise, we got to fight." He raised money. Next one. I'm not sure. No, that's Hangan. Wait a minute. There should be another tiger painting. I'm missing one here. Wait a minute. There's one photograph I have that's not here.
太可惜了，不到59岁就死掉了。
凉拌这不管它
所以香菜都不能生。
I apologize. I think one of my photos did not make it on this list.
不干净啊，什么？它是凉拌来吃。
Yeah, there are many photos of and when Chang Dai-ch'ien and Shansi lived in Suzhou, they lived in the garden of the master of the fishing nets, and in that garden they had their painting studio, and Shansi had pet tigers there.
Yes.
And that he painted.
Yes.
And there's a lot of photographs of the two of them with this baby tiger. They're wonderful. Shansi is a really, I think, a very heroic figure. He was so exhausted. He suffered, as Chang Dai-ch'ien did, from diabetes. And when he came back from raising money for China war relief, he had a very severe heart problem because of his diabetes, and he died right before Chang Dai-ch'ien was on his way to Dunhuang.
Yes.
And the loss of his older brother. The other thing about Chang Shansi is that at one point in his career, he had a one-man show at the Impressionist Museum, the Jeu de Paume in Paris, of 100 of his paintings. The Jeu de Paume, the Impressionist, it's used to be the big Impressionist museum. He had I've tried to find when we were at Cherniwsky, we could, Eric said, yes, he did have that exhibit,
Yeah,
but we can't find documents of it.
It's related to the National Historical Museum.
In Paris?
Yeah, and the president of France.
Yes,
went.
went to that show,
Yeah.
and there are photographs of the president of France
like
with.
the National Historical Museum.
Next
big
time
one.
I go, I try to find
Yeah, very big one.
very
And
big
that's
exhibit. So
Tiger related is that.
wow,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
you see, Chang Shansi really is before Chang Dai-ch'ien becomes famous in Europe. His brother was already starting to be famous in Europe.
1939, when he stayed in Paris, he was telegraphed by Kuomintang government to fly to New York City. to attend the world exposure.
World Fair,
Yeah, World Fair. Because it's
36,
for the World
39,
Fair,
39, yeah.
yeah, Chinese government cannot send a delegation to here, and they ask Shen Zhi as a representative.
Ah, very
Yeah, yeah,
interesting.
so-
But you see how famous Shansi is to
Yeah.
be given that position, that role to do
So
that.
why he did come to United States?
Yeah.
So that means it's a is the first Chinese painter to have solo exhibition. Now I'm changing the rest.
We have to change the record. But you know, the fact that his brother had done that meant that Chang Dai-ch'ien could do it too. So that's part of the story. And Shansi was, I mean, he was the
Let me check
older
if I
brother.
have any question online? Yeah, let me check.
And I can see that picture of the.
没有问题。
I think I have, I can send it to you.
OK， 没有问题。Yeah.
Any questions?
If we have no questions, we can take a rest. We have tea and cookies
Oh, good.
outside.
I need sugar.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, thank you.
No, thank you. This was so much fun. I was so worried.
Okay, okay, great. Okay, we take a break.
Okay.
Us. 好，网上的朋友，谢谢大家，谢谢大家。哈利关掉吧。好。Then we take a break.
Should I say leave meeting?
Yes.